When Albert Whitmore, an 82-year-old retired watchmaker with a flair for bad jokes and an unrelenting curiosity, announced his final wish was to trek across the Sahara Desert, his family thought he'd finally lost it. Armed with little more than a pocket watch, a dusty atlas, and his peculiar sense of humor, Albert set off. What began as a seemingly harmless bucket list trip unraveled into a breathtaking adventure as he stumbled upon a relic that bent the rules of reality itself. Albert Whitmore was not your average octogenarian. At 82 years old, he was a sprightly mix of maddening curiosity and unfiltered sarcasm. He spent his days tinkering with antique watches in his cluttered garage, muttering to himself in a language only he seemed to understand. His neighbors found him odd, his family found him exasperating. But Albert? Albert thought he was a genius. So, when he gathered everyone for his birthday dinner and announced his final wish, no one quite knew how to respond. "I want to trek across the Sahara Desert," Albert declared, tapping his fork against his wine glass. The table fell into an uneasy silence, save for the sound of his grandson Max choking on a piece of bread. "You want to what?" his daughter Laura asked, her voice a mix of disbelief and frustration. "The Sahara," Albert repeated as though it were the most logical thing in the world. "Sand dunes, camels, a chance to finally wear that ridiculous hat you got me last Christmas. What's not to love?" Laura pinched the bridge of her nose. She loved her father dearly, but he was a walking, talking paradox, equal parts wise and utterly ridiculous. "Dad, you're 82. You've never even left the country. Why would you want to start now?" Albert leaned back in his chair, a mischievous grin spreading across his face. "Because, my dear Laura, time waits for no man, and I've always wanted to see the stars where the world feels endless." Max, now recovered, chimed in. "Grandpa, this is nuts. You're more likely to get lost in a sandstorm than find anything cool out there." Albert's grin widened. "Ah, but isn't that the point of an adventure? To get lost? To find something unexpected? Besides," he added, pulling an old tattered map from his jacket pocket, "I've got this." The map was ancient, its edges frayed and its ink faded. It looked like something you'd find in the bargain bin of a thrift store, but Albert held it with reverence. "This," he said, his voice low and serious, "is the key to something extraordinary." Laura sighed. "Dad, that's probably just a tourist map from the 1950s. "Ah, but you see, this map found me," Albert said cryptically, folding it back into his pocket, "and now it's guiding me to my destiny." Over the next few days, Albert's family tried everything to change his mind. They offered him cruises, vacations to Hawaii, even a year's subscription to his favorite watchmaking magazine. But Albert was resolute. He sold his old Buick to fund the trip, packed a single suitcase, and booked a flight to Marrakesh. The airport was a chaotic blend of excited travelers and weary jet-setters, but Albert navigated it with surprising ease. He boarded his flight, much to the dismay of the young couple seated beside him, who were subjected to 2 hours of his dad jokes and unsolicited life advice. "Did you know," Albert said, leaning toward the couple, "that camels have 3 sets of eyelids to protect against sand? Fascinating creatures. I intend to ride one." The woman nodded politely while the man pretended to sleep. Upon arriving in Marrakesh, Albert was immediately captivated by the city's vibrant energy. The souks buzzed with life, the air was thick with the scent of spices, and the architecture was a stunning blend of old and new. Albert wandered through the maze-like streets, his map clutched tightly in his hand. It didn't take long for Albert to realize he needed a guide. Entered Tariq, a young nomad with piercing green eyes and an air of impatience. Tariq reluctantly agreed to help, though he made it clear he thought Albert was insane. "You want to cross the Sahara at your age?" Tariq asked, his arms crossed. Albert nodded enthusiastically. "Why not? Life's too short to play it safe." Tariq sighed. "Fine, But don't blame me if you end up as a skeleton in the sand." With Tariq's help, Albert acquired a camel named Balthazar, who seemed just as skeptical of the journey as his guide. They set off early the next morning, the sun casting long shadows across the dunes. Albert's spirits were high, though he quickly discovered that riding a camel was far less glamorous than he'd imagined. As the days passed, Albert regaled Tariq with stories of his youth, his failed inventions, and his theories about time and space. Tariq listened, though he often rolled his eyes, muttering, "Crazy old man," under his breath. One evening, as they set up camp under a sky full of stars, Albert pulled out his pocket watch. "This," he said, holding it up to the light, "is my most prized possession. Made it myself, you know. It's more than a watch. It's a reminder that time is precious." Tariq raised an eyebrow. "And yet you want to waste it wandering through a desert?" Albert chuckled. "Ah, but this is where time feels infinite. Don't you feel it? The endless sand, the silence, the stars. It's like the world has paused just for us." Tariq didn't respond, but as he stared up at the night sky, he couldn't help but feel a flicker of something he couldn't quite name. Perhaps the old man wasn't entirely crazy after all. Albert's second day in the Sahara brought a rude awakening. Literally. Balthazar, the ever-skeptical camel, had taken to biting Albert's boots in protest of their early departure time. Tariq, sipping his morning tea and chuckling at the scene, shrugged. "He doesn't like you," he said simply. "Well, the feeling is mutual," Albert huffed, pulling his boot free. "Ungrateful beast." Despite the rocky start, Albert's enthusiasm hadn't waned. He pored over his map as they trudged through the dunes, pointing to landmarks that Tariq claimed didn't exist. "There, that's the dunes of Whispering Echoes," Albert said, jabbing a finger at the paper. Tariq squinted at the horizon, which was an endless expanse of identical sand dunes. "There's no such thing." "Not with that attitude, there isn't," Albert shot back, folding the map with a flourish. Tariq muttered something in Arabic, but Albert chose to interpret it as encouragement. The journey was grueling. The sun beat down mercilessly and the sand seemed to shift underfoot as if it had a mind of its own. Albert, however, seemed immune to discomfort. He regaled Tariq with more stories from his youth, including one about the time he accidentally dismantled a church clock during Sunday service. "Turns out," Albert said, grinning, "people don't appreciate punctuality when it comes at the cost of their morning prayers." Tariq shook his head but couldn't suppress a small smile. The old man was undeniably entertaining, if not entirely sane. As the afternoon wore on, the landscape began to change. The dunes grew taller, their peaks sharp and jagged, and the air carried a faint, eerie whistle. Even Balthazar, normally indifferent to his surroundings, seemed uneasy, his ears flicking at every sound. "This is it," Albert said, his voice tinged with excitement. "The Whispering Dunes. I told you they were real." Tariq frowned. "It's just wind. The dunes aren't alive." "Ah, but what if they are?" Albert countered. He dismounted, his knees creaking in protest, and began climbing one of the larger dunes. Tariq followed reluctantly, muttering under his breath about foolish tourists. At the top, they found something neither of them had expected, a series of ancient carvings etched into the sand-covered rocks. The symbols were intricate, almost hypnotic, and they seemed to pulse faintly in the dimming light. Tariq's eyes widened. This shouldn't be here. The desert doesn't keep secrets like this." Albert grinned triumphantly. "And yet, here it is. Looks like your desert has a few tricks up its sleeve." As they examined the carvings, the wind picked up, and the faint whistle grew louder, almost melodic. Tariq looked around nervously. "We shouldn't stay here. This place isn't normal." "Nonsense," Albert said, pulling out his notebook. He began sketching the symbols, muttering to himself about their possible meanings. Tariq, meanwhile, kept a wary eye on the horizon. Just as Albert finished his sketch, the wind shifted dramatically and a wall of sand rose in the distance. Tariq grabbed Albert's arm. "Sandstorm, we need to move, now." Albert hesitated, clearly torn between his curiosity and self-preservation. "Fine," he said finally, tucking his notebook away. "But we're coming back." They scrambled down the dune and urged Balthazar into motion. The camel, sensing the urgency, moved faster than Albert had thought possible. The storm chased them relentlessly, the wind howling like a living thing. By the time they reached a rocky outcrop for shelter, the storm was upon them. They huddled together, the air thick with sand and noise. Albert clutched his pocket watch tightly, its ticking barely audible over the roar of the wind. When the storm finally passed, the desert was unrecognizable. The dunes had shifted, and the carvings they had found were buried once more. Tariq looked at Albert, his expression a mix of relief and frustration. "This is why you don't mess with the desert. It doesn't like being disturbed." Albert, however, was undeterred. He pulled out his notebook, now smeared with sand but still legible. "We found something incredible today," he said, his eyes alight with excitement. "And I'm not stopping until we uncover its secrets." Tariq sighed but didn't argue. The old man's determination was contagious, and though he would never admit it, he was beginning to feel the pull of the mystery as well. That night, as they camped under a sky filled with stars, Albert couldn't help but reflect on the carvings. The symbols weren't random. They seemed to hold meaning, though he couldn't decipher it yet. Tariq, noticing Albert's deep concentration, asked, "Why do you care so much about this?" Albert looked up, his face illuminated by the soft glow of the campfire. "Because life should be more than just passing time. It should be about finding the extraordinary." Tariq said nothing, but Albert's words lingered in his mind as the desert winds whispered around them. The third day in the Sahara began with unsettling quiet. The winds that had howled through the dunes the night before were gone, replaced by an eerie stillness. Albert, however, seemed unfazed. He was up before dawn, meticulously examining his notebook and muttering to himself about the carvings they had discovered. Tariq watched him from a distance, sipping tea and wondering, not for the first time, why he had agreed to guide this eccentric old man. "You're unusually quiet today," Albert said, breaking the silence as he packed up his gear. "I'm thinking," Tariq replied. "About the carvings?" Albert asked, his eyes lighting up. "No, about why I agreed to this madness," Tariq deadpanned. Albert chuckled, unbothered. "Ah, but isn't life more interesting this way? You're not just surviving, you're living." Tariq didn't respond, but a small part of him couldn't deny that Albert's relentless optimism was beginning to rub off on him. They set off just as the first rays of sunlight painted the dunes in gold and orange. Albert consulted his map at every opportunity, despite Tariq's expertise. Something about the map unnerved Tariq. Its landmarks seemed to shift subtly, almost imperceptibly, as if the map were alive. "Doesn't that bother you?" Tariq asked, pointing at the map. "It's like it changes every time you look at it." Albert grinned, folding the map. "That's how you know it's special. It's alive, Tariq, responding to us. Don't you see? We're part of the journey." Tariq shook his head, muttering, "Crazy old man." By midday, the sun was relentless. Even Albert, with his boundless enthusiasm, began to feel its effects. They paused in the shadow of a towering dune, Balthazar collapsing gratefully. Albert pulled out his pocket watch, its ticking oddly comforting. "What's the story behind that watch?" Tariq asked. Albert smiled. "I made it years ago. It's not just a watch, it's a reminder. Time is precious, but it's never too late to start something new." Tariq nodded thoughtfully, his skepticism giving way to a begrudging respect. A faint sound reached their ears, a low, rhythmic thrum that seemed to emanate from the ground. Albert froze. "Do you hear that?" Tariq nodded, his hand instinctively on his dagger. "What is it?" Albert didn't answer. Instead, he climbed the nearest dune, his movements surprisingly agile for his age. Tariq followed, unwilling to let the old man out of sight. At the top, they found the source, a massive stone structure partially buried in the sand. Its surface was covered in intricate carvings, similar to those they had found earlier. The structure pulsed faintly, the air around it humming with energy. Albert's face lit up. This is it. This is what the map was leading us to. Tariq hesitated. The structure felt wrong, as if it didn't belong. "We should leave. This place isn't natural." "Nonsense," Albert replied, descending toward the structure. Tariq hesitated before following, his instincts screaming to turn back. The carvings seemed to shift when viewed from different angles, the air charged with strange energy. Albert, undeterred, compared them to his notebook sketches. "It's a language," he muttered. "A code, perhaps, or a message." Tariq didn't respond. His attention was on the horizon, where a dark shape moved toward them. "Albert," he said, tense. "We have company." Albert looked up, squinting. The shape grew larger, a man on horseback, his face obscured by a scarf. Tariq stepped forward, dagger ready. The man dismounted, pulling down his scarf to reveal piercing blue eyes. "You shouldn't be here," he said. Albert stepped forward. "And who are you to say that?" The man ignored him, eyes narrowing at the structure. "This place is cursed. Leave now, before it's too late." Albert opened his mouth to argue, but Tariq grabbed his arm. "He's right. We need to go." Albert hesitated. The man's warning, combined with Tariq's fear, gave him pause. But curiosity won. "Just give me a little more time," he said, pulling free. "I need to understand." The man shook his head. "If you stay, you'll regret it." Albert ignored him, returning to the carvings. Tariq and the man exchanged a glance, both realizing nothing short of force would move him. As the sun set, the structure's hum grew louder. The air felt heavy, thick with something unseen. Albert, oblivious to the growing danger, continued his work, notebook filling with sketches. Tariq and the man kept watch, their unease growing with each passing moment. "You don't know what you're doing," the man warned. "This isn't just a relic. It's a key to something far beyond us." Albert glanced up. "Exactly why I can't leave. Don't you want to know what's beyond us?" The man fell silent, but his expression darkened. When the first star appeared, the carvings glowed, pulsing in time with the rhythmic hum. Albert looked up, his face a mixture of awe and fear. "It's a key," he whispered, "but to what?" The man stepped forward, his hand on his sword. "You're about to find out," he said grimly. The glowing carvings on the structure pulsed rhythmically, their light cutting through the desert night. The hum grew louder, vibrating through the ground beneath their feet. Albert crouched near the carvings, notebook open, while Tariq and the mysterious man stood uneasily at the edge, their instincts screaming to flee. "This is remarkable," Albert said, voice filled with awe. "The precision. It's almost as if it was crafted by something beyond human understanding." "You don't understand," the man said sharply. "This isn't just a relic. It's a door, and it should stay closed." "A door?" Albert asked, his curiosity piqued. "To where?" "To places mankind was never meant to go," the man replied grimly. "If you value your life, you'll walk away now." Tariq shifted uneasily, his hand resting on the hilt of his dagger. "Albert, maybe he's right. This doesn't feel right. It feels wrong." Albert shook his head, his curiosity overpowering caution. "If this is a door, it's worth opening. What if it holds knowledge, technology, something that could change the world?" "It could also destroy it," the man countered coldly, his eyes fixed on the structure as if reliving a long-buried nightmare. The carvings glowed brighter, their pulses quickening. The hum grew deafening, and the ground beneath them trembled. Albert stumbled back, his eyes wide as the sand swirled violently around the base of the structure, revealing a circular void, black and infinite. From it came a low, resonant sound, like a deep, otherworldly heartbeat. "It's beautiful," Albert whispered, stepping closer to the opening. "Stop!" the man barked, grabbing Albert's arm. "You don't know what's in there." Albert pulled free, his eyes filled with a mix of wonder and resolve. "This is what I've been searching for," he said softly. "Something extraordinary, something beyond us." The man turned to Tariq, desperation flashing in his eyes. "We can't let him go in. Whatever's in there, it's not meant for us." Tariq hesitated, torn between his loyalty to Albert and the growing sense of dread. "Albert," he said, his voice firm but pleading, "you don't need to do this. You've already found something incredible. Isn't that enough?" Albert glanced at Tariq, his expression softening briefly, but his gaze returned to the void, and his resolve hardened. "I can't stop now. This could be the answer to questions mankind has asked for centuries." Before anyone could stop him, Albert stepped into the void. The moment his foot crossed the threshold, the world around him shifted. The hum disappeared, replaced by eerie silence. The air felt thick, almost tangible, and the darkness enveloped him completely. For a moment, Albert thought he had been swallowed whole by the void. Then, slowly, faint lights began to appear, swirling and dancing around him like distant stars. Tariq and the man stood frozen at the edge, their hearts pounding. "We have to go after him," Tariq said, his voice tight with urgency. "No," the man said, grabbing Tariq's arm. "If we follow, we'll be lost too. Whatever's in there, it's not for us." "We can't leave him," Tariq shouted, pulling free. "He trusted me to guide him, and I'm not going to abandon him now." The man shook his head, his expression grim. "Then you'll share his fate." Ignoring the warning, Tariq took a deep breath and stepped into the void. Inside, the world was unlike anything he had imagined. The darkness wasn't empty. It was alive, filled with swirling patterns of light and shadow that moved with purpose. The air buzzed with an energy that made his skin tingle. Ahead of him, he saw Albert standing still, his head tilted back as he gazed at the lights above. "Albert!" Tariq called, his voice echoing strangely in the void. Albert turned, his face illuminated by the ethereal glow. "Isn't it magnificent?" he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "This is what's beyond us, Tariq. A world we can't even begin to understand." But as Tariq stepped closer, he noticed something alarming. The lights weren't just swirling, they were converging. Slowly but surely, they were gathering into a single point directly above Albert. "Albert, we need to leave," Tariq said urgently, grabbing his arm. "This place, it's not safe." Albert hesitated, his gaze fixed on the point of light above him. But what if it's trying to communicate? What if... Before he could finish, the light burst outward, filling the void with a blinding brilliance. Tariq shielded his eyes, his grip on Albert tightening. The energy in the air surged, and a deep, resonant voice echoed through the void. The words were unintelligible, but the intent was clear. They were not welcome. The light began to pull back, the swirling patterns collapsing inward. The void trembled and the air grew heavier, almost suffocating. Tariq didn't wait for an invitation. He pulled Albert toward the opening, shouting, "We have to go!" Albert resisted briefly, his eyes filled with regret. But as the light grew more intense and the void began to collapse, he relented. Together they stumbled back through the opening, collapsing onto the sand outside. The moment they were out, the structure sealed itself, the carvings fading until they were faint etchings. The hum ceased, and the desert was silent once more. Albert lay on the sand, breathing heavily, his eyes fixed on the now quiet structure. "It wasn't ready," he said softly. "Or maybe we weren't." The man stood over them, his expression unreadable. You were lucky, he said. The desert doesn't give second chances. Tariq helped Albert to his feet, his mind racing with questions. But as they turned to leave, the man stopped them. You've seen too much, he said. The desert will decide what happens next. And with that, he disappeared into the dunes, leaving Albert and Tariq alone under the starlit sky. Albert and Tariq sat in silence, the man's parting words echoing in their minds. The desert will decide what happens next. Albert clutched his notebook tightly, its pages filled with hurried sketches and fragmented notes that now felt more ominous than thrilling. What do you think he meant? Tariq finally asked, breaking the stillness. Albert sighed, his gaze distant. I don't know, but whatever it is, we've crossed a threshold. We're in the middle of something extraordinary. Tariq frowned, his frustration evident. Extraordinary? We barely escaped alive. That thing didn't want us there, Albert. It wasn't a relic. It was alive. And dangerous. Albert's grip on the notebook tightened. That's exactly why we need to understand it. Fear doesn't solve mysteries, Tariq. Curiosity does. Tariq let out a sharp laugh. Curiosity will get us killed. He turned away, muttering to himself. Balthazar, unimpressed by their exchange, let out a loud snort and lay down. The night descended quickly and the silence grew unnerving. Even the desert winds seemed to have stilled, leaving only the crackle of their campfire. Albert sat near the flames, flipping through his notes while Tariq remained alert, his dagger resting on his knee. Do you hear that? Tariq asked suddenly, his voice tense. Albert looked up, startled. Hear what? At first, there was nothing but the fire's crackle. Then, faintly, a sound reached their ears. A whispering, so soft it could have been mistaken for the wind. It's the same sound from the carvings, Albert said, standing. It's following us. Tariq's hand moved to his dagger. The desert doesn't follow people, but something else might. The whispering grew louder, circling their camp like an unseen predator. The flames flickered, bending unnaturally as though bowing to the force. Albert moved toward the darkness, his gaze searching the horizon. Don't wander off, Tariq barked, grabbing his arm. Albert pulled free. We'll never know what's out there if we stay put. Reluctantly, Tariq followed. The sand beneath their feet felt strange, softer, almost alive. The whispering stopped abruptly, replaced by an oppressive silence. Ahead, the dunes began to shift, the sand rising and falling like waves. What the hell is that? Tariq whispered, his voice tight with unease. The sand parted, revealing a massive, stone-like figure rising from the desert. Its surface was etched with carvings that glowed faintly, the light pulsing in time with an invisible rhythm. Albert froze, his breath catching. It's another one. But it's moving. The figure's movements were deliberate and precise, its form both humanoid and alien. A low, resonant hum vibrated through the air, the same sound they had heard earlier. Tariq took a step back, his dagger raised. Albert, we need to leave. Now. Albert shook his head, mesmerized. It's not attacking. It's observing. Observing, or deciding how to kill us, Tariq muttered. The figure stopped, its glowing carvings shifting like liquid light. Then it raised an arm and pointed directly at Albert. The hum grew louder, vibrating through their very bones. Albert felt an inexplicable pull, as if the figure were calling to him. It's communicating, he said, his voice distant. Albert, don't, Tariq shouted, grabbing his arm. We don't know what it wants. Albert stepped closer, his body moving almost involuntarily. The figure lowered its arm, and the hum softened, becoming melodic. Albert reached out, his hand trembling, and touched one of the glowing carvings. The moment his fingers made contact, a surge of energy shot through him. Images flooded his mind, worlds beyond comprehension, civilizations rising and falling, their histories written in the stars. He saw Earth, fragile and interconnected with something vast and unknowable. Albert stumbled back, gasping. Tariq caught him, his expression a mix of anger and concern. "What did it do to you?" Albert shook his head, his voice shaky. "It showed me everything. The past, the future, the connections between them." Before Albert could elaborate, the figure began to dissolve, its stone-like form crumbling into sand. The glowing carvings faded, and the hum disappeared, leaving only silence. "It's gone," Albert said softly. "For now," Tariq replied grimly, "but I don't think it's the last we'll see of them." They returned to camp in silence, the weight of what they had witnessed hanging heavily between them. Albert clutched his notebook, his resolve stronger than ever. Whatever this was, he needed to understand it. But deep down, they both knew the desert was far from finished with them. Albert woke before sunrise, his body heavy with exhaustion but his mind alive with the visions the figure had shown him. He sat by the remnants of the campfire, staring into the dying embers. Tariq was still asleep, his dagger lying close at hand, his expression tense even in rest. The desert was eerily calm, the whispering gone, but Albert couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He opened his notebook, flipping through sketches and notes that now felt incomplete. He needed answers, and he was certain they lay further into the desert. "You're up early," Tariq said groggily, sitting up and stretching. His hand instinctively went to his dagger. "What now, Albert? Do we leave this madness behind, or are you planning to chase more trouble?" Albert looked at him, his expression resolute. "We keep going. Whatever's out there, it's not finished with us, and I'm not finished with it." Tariq groaned, muttering curses under his breath. "You're going to get us killed, old man." But he began packing up their supplies, resigned to the fact that he wouldn't leave Albert to face the desert alone. They set off as the first light of dawn painted the dunes in shades of gold and pink. The air was cool, but Albert could feel an undercurrent of tension, as though the desert itself was bracing for something. Balthazar plodded along behind them, blissfully unaware of the unseen forces that seemed to surround them. Hours passed in silence, the only sound the crunch of sand beneath their boots. Albert consulted his notebook frequently, comparing his sketches to the landscape. Tariq watched him warily, his dagger never far from his grasp. Finally, as the sun reached its zenith, they came upon another structure. This one was larger than the first, its carvings more intricate, and its surface pulsing faintly with light even in the harsh midday sun. Albert's breath caught. "This is it," he said softly. "This is what the first one was leading us to." Tariq frowned, his grip tightening on his dagger. "And what if this one doesn't let us leave?" Albert ignored him, stepping closer to the structure. The carvings seemed to shift and change as he approached, their patterns almost hypnotic. He placed a hand on the surface and the faint pulsing grew stronger, resonating through his body. "Albert, don't," Tariq began, but it was too late. The carvings flared brightly, and a deep hum filled the air, louder and more powerful than before. The ground trembled beneath their feet, and the air around them grew thick with energy. Albert stumbled back, his mind once again flooded with images. This time, the visions were clearer. He saw not just worlds, but beings. Tall, luminous figures with eyes that seemed to pierce through time itself. They stood in circles around massive structures like the one before him, their hands raised as if in communion with the universe. He felt their thoughts, their purpose, their warning. The desert isn't just a place. It's a boundary, a barrier between worlds. Albert fell to his knees, gasping for air. Tariq was beside him in an instant, pulling him away from the structure. "What did you see?" he demanded, his voice sharp with fear. Albert shook his head, his voice trembling. "They're guardians. This place, it's not meant for us. It's meant to keep us out." Tariq's frown deepened. "Then why are we still here? Let's leave before they change their minds." But the structure wasn't finished. The carvings flared again, and a shape began to emerge from its surface. A figure similar to the one they had seen the night before, but larger, more imposing. Its movements were deliberate, its glowing eyes fixed on Albert. "It's coming," Tariq hissed, pulling Albert to his feet. "We need to go." Albert didn't move. He felt rooted to the spot, his gaze locked with the figures. It raised an arm and the hum shifted, becoming almost melodic. Albert felt the pull again, stronger this time, but he resisted. "What do you want from us?" he shouted, his voice cracking. The figure paused, its glowing carvings shifting. Then, in a voice that seemed to echo from the depths of the earth, it spoke. The words were unintelligible, but their meaning was clear. "You are not ready." The figure lowered its arm and the carvings dimmed. The hum faded, and the desert was silent once more. The figure dissolved into the structure, leaving no trace of its presence. Albert and Tariq stood frozen, their breaths shallow. Finally, Tariq broke the silence. "That's it, we're done. I don't care what answers you're looking for, Albert. The desert doesn't want us here." Albert nodded slowly, his resolve shaken. "You're right. We've seen enough." They turned and began their journey back, the weight of what they had experienced pressing heavily on their shoulders. Albert's notebook remained clutched in his hand, its pages filled with more questions than answers. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the whispering returned, faint but persistent. The desert wasn't finished with them after all.